you everyone for coming. My name is Alfredo Gonzalez. I am the Reproduction of Race and Racial Ideologies Workshop Coordinator. I wanted to thank Tracy Matthews, Sarah Jones, and Sarah Tiffany for helping make tonight possible. Today we're going to continue with our quarter, which is themed around race and capital, and curated by Professor Michael Dawson. And I'm happy to introduce Dr. Bhashkar Mazumder, who is the senior economist and research advisor and director of the Chicago Census Research and Data Center at the Federal Reserve of Chicago. Dr. Mazumder received his PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. And today he is presenting his paper entitled Black-White Differences in Intergenerational Economic Mobility in the U.S. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mazumder.
Thank you. I think I will stand since I'm so used to doing that. Okay, so part of the research, the reason I have a disclaimer here is that part of the research used data from the Chicago Census Research Data Center. And if at any point you want to learn more about that, we can talk about that, or feel free to send me an email about that. Okay, so I thought to kind of motivate part of what this talk is about, I put this quote up from President Obama from a speech he gave on inequality in Kansas in 2013. And when I did my dissertation in 2001 on intergenerational mobility, and from time to time the topic's gotten attention, but it was great to see this get incredibly prominent attention in recent years. So President Obama in the speech talked about this idea that there's a dangerous and growing inequality and lack of upward mobility, and referred to this recent trend as the defining challenge of our time. So it's a pretty basic and fundamental issue that's received a lot of importance, and I'm going to talk some more about what do we mean by upward mobility, and for that matter, downward mobility. And I'm going to focus in this paper on racial differences. Okay, and really, this is, I would think, one of the fundamental questions in social sciences in the U.S., given the legacy of slavery in this country and segregation for generations afterwards. And so a fundamental question is, given an initial condition in which you have very large disparities in many measures of capital, socioeconomic status, how long does it take for those kinds of fundamentally large gaps to narrow over time? And my interest in this topic of intergenerational mobility, even though a lot of my research wasn't focused on race, my initial interest was sparked in part by race, because at the time I was in graduate school in California, there was a lot of attention being paid to affirmative action and calls to eliminate affirmative action as a method for determining university slots. And to me, I always felt like a big part of this question was really quantitative. If you were to hypothetically agree that affirmative action might be a reasonable way to go, how long would you need it for? Would you just need it for a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations? And when I got exposed to the literature on intergenerational mobility, I realized that the measures that were being used offered a way to potentially quantify it. How many generations do you need before you see persistence between the outcomes of kids and their parents? How persistent was that? And that can also tell you how many generations would it take for those gaps to disappear. for this paper, and something I can talk about more if it's of interest, is there's also sort of a methodological issue in that a lot of the measures that have been commonly used to study intergenerational mobility don't lend themselves well to answering questions about racial differences in intergenerational mobility if we're interested in how they translate into the overall income distribution. That is, if you want to study the relationship between incomes, say within African Americans, between parents and their children, that rate of persistence doesn't necessarily tell you how quickly gaps will close. What you want is some method that would be able to look at how racial differences in mobility exist with respect to the national distribution. And so part of what I do in this paper is use rank-based measures where the ranks are calculated with respect to the national distribution. And then there are other issues with respect to the fact that the data that we have on hand to study intergenerational mobility is, studying intergenerational mobility basically is extremely challenging. What you would ideally like to do is measure people's lifetime income in a parent generation and then in the kid generation for people in the same family. So there's not that much data out there that allows you to do that. And so when we have had data, and a lot of studies that started on this have used, for example, the panel study of income dynamics from the University of Michigan, where you're starting with just a few hundred father-son or father-child pairs, and if only 10% of that are African American families, you're going to have very small samples. Okay, and then part of what I wanted to do in this paper was to explore at a very kind of first pass level what could be explanations for group differences in intergenerational mobility, and maybe that lends itself to thinking about explanations for patterns in intergenerational mobility more broadly. So if we find that the differences are due to, say, wealth or family structure, then maybe that tells us what kinds of policies we want to be thinking about. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on the literature review, but I did want to mention that there was a book chapter by Tom Hertz in a volume edited by Bowles, Gintis, and Osborne that really was the first to kind of address some of the issues that I'm going to be talking about in terms of using a method to study intergenerational mobility differences between blacks and whites with respect to the national distribution. And the findings were basically similar to what I'm going to present to you today. In some sense, what I hope I can show you is that larger samples and using arguably better data confirm what Hertz found. And so kind of two of the big points he made was that there's a greater persistence of blacks at the bottom of the income distribution, in other words, lower upward mobility. And in particular, this idea of moving from the very bottom to the very top is extremely low among African American families. Okay. So I'm going to talk about using both measures and better data. So why don't I jump ahead to the data. I'm going to use two sources. One is the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, this 1979, which basically followed about 12,000, 13,000 individuals from 1979 onwards. And for a few years early in the survey, they asked about family income. So this survey has been relatively underutilized for studying intergenerational mobility, but because there are a few years where they ask about family income, it can be used for that purpose, and they're sort of oversample of blacks. And by using family income, I'm going to also be able to include women in the analysis, because I'm going to sort of say at the family level, using all sources of income, including the spouse, where do you stand in the income distribution. I'm also going to do all of the analysis using a census survey called the SIP, Survey of Income and Program Participation, matched to administrative data. So here what's going to be nice is that you have not self-reported income, but actual earnings data reported through employers, and you have it for a sample where you don't have to worry about people leaving the survey in subsequent years, so you can put together longer time spans of income data. So in a little more detail on this slide, I'm basically going to be tracking in the NLSY 79 cohorts of individuals who were born from the late 50s to the early 60s. I'm going to be using family income because that's all that's available in the parent generation, and use up to a 3-year average. And in this analysis, I'm actually going to be able to include zeros because essentially because I'm using ranks in the distribution, it's not required. A lot of, I guess what I didn't say is a lot of the other analysis relies on taking logs of income, which you can't do if you have zeros. So it's a little bit different than some of the other literature. I'll have a sample of about 7,000, including blacks and whites, where men and women are going to be observed from their early 30s to their late 40s. In the second data set, I'm going to pool together a bunch of these SIP panels matched to Social Security data. I'll have a much broader range of birth cohorts going all the way out to the early 80s. Here I'm going to also be able to use longer time averages of income, so up to a 5-year average of the earnings of both parents, and a 9-year average of kids' earnings, because in this literature there's a lot of concern about measurement errors. So by using 2 different samples that have different characteristics, but I'm going to show you largely result in very similar outcomes, it suggests that measurement concerns aren't going to be what's driving the results here. One big difference is because this is only earnings data, and I don't, I'm going to use men only because of labor force participation issues, because you always run into this issue where if you don't observe women who are, prime childbearing age, is that a select sample of people who are in the labor force. But with the NLSY, I'll be able to use both. Feel free to interrupt me with any questions. So the main measure that I'm going to talk about today is going to be what I called an upward transition probability. Defined it kind of algebraically, but in words, it's essentially thinking about a given percentile. If that percentile is the 20th percentile of the income distribution, it's basically asking what's the probability of moving out of the bottom quintile. So I'm going to say if when you were a child, your parents were at or below the 20th percentile, what's the probability that you attain a percentile in the distribution higher than that? And in principle, I'm going to show you figures where I'm going to vary that across the bottom half of the income distribution. So you could ask questions like, if you started in the bottom half, what's the probability that you moved out? And we can look at that separately for whites and for blacks, but we can hold the distribution fixed to be the national distribution. And similarly, we could look at downward mobility. So for example, what's the probability of falling out of the top half of the income distribution? Okay, and so I'll just jump right into some basic statistics. I'm going to mainly show you figures, but I thought I'd start by showing you a table of results. So I highlighted this row where essentially I'm saying if in the parent generation you were in the bottom quintile, anywhere from the 1st to the 20th percentile, this is the sample of whites and blacks that I'm using, and you can see with the oversample I have quite a bit. For whites, the probability of exceeding the bottom quintile, if you started in the bottom quintile, is close to about 75%. For blacks, it's just under 50%. These are the standard errors on this, so these are, you know, highly statistically significant and different from one another. And here I've simply taken the white minus black difference, and that's about 27 percentage points. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is show you these arrayed in a figure. So this blue line is showing you that probability if you were in the bottom decile. For whites, the probability of getting out of the bottom decile was over 80%. If you were in the bottom quintile, it's about 75%, the same number I showed you before. And you see the same number for blacks. The green line just plots that difference. And you see, regardless of where you start in the bottom half of the income distribution, these are sort of accumulating samples. So if you go from the bottom quintile to the entire bottom half of the income distribution, you see that the probabilities decline because now you're starting from a more favorable position. So your probability of exceeding it goes down, but that gap basically stays roughly constant. And you see it ranges from about 20 to 30 percentage points. The solid lines are showing you the family income measures that include both men and women from the NLSY. And the dashed lines are using these longer time averages, but just of labor market earnings from the administrative data. And you see, regardless of which you use, the numbers are pretty similar. Okay. In terms of downward transition probabilities, here we're asking, what's the probability of moving, for example, here, below the entire bottom half of the income distribution. Here, what's the probability of moving just out of the top decile at the 90th percentile? And you see that not only are blacks disadvantaged in the sense that they have lower upward mobility out of the bottom, they also have higher downward mobility out of the top. And to some degree, I think this fact has probably gotten less attention. In stories about intergenerational mobility, it's typically couched in terms of upward mobility, and thinking about equality of opportunity is typically thinking about giving everyone the opportunity to succeed and to do better, but a part of intergenerational mobility is also the opportunity to fall out of the top. And here you see this racial difference as well. Now, out of the very top of the distribution, you get slightly different numbers between using the earnings data and the family income data, and that might be consistent with the idea that you're a little bit more selective when you see just administrative earnings data. But for the most part, you see the differences are statistically significant and range from, roughly, if you think about the probability of moving out of the top half of the distribution where the estimates are all fairly consistent and robust, it's about a 20 percentage point difference. So slightly smaller than the racial gap in upward mobility, but still pretty significant. So just to kind of summarize, you see these pretty sizable gaps in upward mobility and downward mobility, and they're pretty similar with either data set you use. So I think I've basically said most of these points. What I then wanted to turn to, and this is a little bit harder to see, is what you can do is also present kind of an entire matrix of mobility at different points of the income distribution, and then think about what that, if you took that literally to say, these are the probabilities of moving across the income distribution in perpetuity, and sort of say the same way you would in an ecological model of various other biological things, you might sort of say, what is the steady state distribution land? If everybody kind of went through these matrices, where would we end up? So first let me walk through what these matrices show. Each row here is talking about families that are starting at different quintiles. So this first row is showing you if you start at the bottom quintile in the parent generation, the columns are showing you where you end up in the kids' generation, and this left-hand side box is for whites, the right-hand side is for blacks. So for example, if you start in the bottom quintile, your probability of being in the bottom quintile in the next generation is 26%, which is basically 1 minus that 75, 74% for whites. It's about 50% staying in the bottom for blacks. And here you can see sort of the rags to riches story. Even for whites, their probability of getting to the top quintile is only about 10%. For African American families, it's less than 4%. So you see that divide. You also see that persistence at the very top here. Those who start at the top quintile for whites, 38% remain there, only 24% remain there among blacks. And interestingly, if you look for black families who start in the top quintile, it almost appears to be like random where you end up in the next generation. And so this is, again, that point about downward mobility. Being able to sustain advantages when they occur appear to be a real problem. So if you translate this into what does this imply for a steady state distribution of income, it would imply that there would be no closing of the racial gap, that in the steady state you would see roughly 40% of blacks in the bottom quintile of the overall distribution and only 8% in the top quintile, and I'll show you the comparable numbers for whites. But a point I really would want to emphasize is that this would contrast with earlier historical periods where we did see sustained racial progress, and highlighted a couple of things. Anytime you give a talk, it's an excuse to tout your own work. So, if you're interested in this, I could talk some more about it. I have two papers that look at earlier historical periods of sustained black progress. One was the Rosenwald schools. So Julius Rosenwald, who's has a strong connection with this area, having lived in Hyde Park, he was the CEO of, he was president of Sears around the turn of the 20th century, and with Booker T. Washington basically embarked on a program where they built 5,000 schools in the rural South for blacks. And in an earlier paper with my colleague Dan Aronson, we argue that the building of these schools can explain roughly a half of the black-white gains in a variety of measures, such as literacy, test scores, and education between the world wars, between cohorts born between the world wars. And in another paper, I argue that the desegregation of hospitals in the South during the 1960s as part of the civil rights era can explain a significant fraction of the closing of black-white gaps in test scores in the 1980s and income in the 1990s. So while these are pretty startling numbers that can make us feel pretty pessimistic, at the same time, there are things that I don't believe are necessarily a permanent feature of the American economy. I mean, it's hard to know. Perhaps this was the anomaly, and this will be what we see going forward. But hopefully, it's the reverse. But in any case, these are what the numbers would imply if the cohorts born from the 50s to the 80s continue to, if those patterns are experienced by cohorts growing up today, we wouldn't be very optimistic about closing of racial gaps. Okay, I'll skip through this. It's about my earlier work. So I'll end with showing you a few charts about trying to kind of scratch the surface a bit, because these are far from definitive and come with lots of caveats. But we might want to think about what factors explain upward and downward mobility. So to do that, I'm going to show you a series of figures that are based on some regressions. We're going to put some right-hand side variable along the x-axis, and what you can think of is these are sort of the unconditional on that right-hand side variable, what the upward mobility out of the bottom quintile looks like. For whites, we saw it was 75%, for blacks 48%, and the gap. And if some right-hand side variable was correlated with upward mobility, then we would expect the blue and red lines to be upward sloping. I'll show you in a minute, say this was something like education. If upward mobility was increasing in years of education, we'd expect these lines to be upward sloping. And if they help to reduce the black-white gap, we'd expect the blue and red lines to get closer and the green line to go down and move closer to 0. So I'll show you, there are more in the paper, I just picked a few to talk about here. And I show you the shaded lines are what was in the previous slide of this sort of unconditional mobility. Here I look at how does upward transition probability change as you look at increasing years of completed schooling. And you see, in fact, that the lines do slope upward, that among those who start in the bottom quintile, if you go all the way to the right here where people have finished college, you see that the probabilities get equalized. They might even be higher for African American families with a college degree, although there is some noise here. So, you know, it's not obvious that difference is statistically different from 0 until you get to the really highest levels of education. So in that sense, that's hopeful. On the other hand, where a lot of the education distribution lies for African Americans, there's still a sizable gap. So there's a lot that we need to do to push education from where we are now to over here. But it's hopeful in that sense that among those who do get to tertiary degrees, that we can hopefully see some improvement. This chart shows the same thing using father's education, and you get kind of a similar story. Here what I did was in labor economics, it's common to use test scores, particularly test scores from the Armed Forces qualifying test. So this was given in the NLSY sample to everyone as a way of norming the military test scores. And as in other studies, when you look at, when you sort of control for these kinds of test scores that are taken in adolescents, you see a remarkable closing of black-white gaps. So they're not fully closed. And there's also several important caveats to this, so I'll talk about one or two of them in a moment, so I don't want to push this too much. But if you took it at face value, it suggests that whatever it is that allows for academic achievement by adolescence strongly equalizes your probability of being upwardly mobile. This chart is looking at family structure, so it's a very simple division. For this analysis, we used the SIP sample where they had questions looking at your family background going backward in time. So we classified people by whether they were always in a two-parent family or whether they ever had just one parent. And you see among two-parent families some closing up of the upward mobility gap, but still there being a fairly significant difference. Okay, and here we use wealth data from the SIP, where they asked about a whole assortment of assets and liabilities, and you can see that here those at the very low end of the net worth distribution, there's a pretty sizable black-white gap in upward mobility that starts to narrow a little bit, but then stays roughly constant. So possibly a story coming out of here is that extremely low wealth levels inhibit upward mobility, but beyond that, it's not clear. Now again, there's lots of people who don't answer this question. This might vary quite a bit by where you live and other factors. So I tend to think that wealth is a fairly important and understudied element, at least in my discipline, in looking at mobility differences. So this is something I'd like to look in greater detail in future work. But this first pass evidence shows something to it, but not a lot. Okay, and then finally I'll show you a couple of charts doing the same thing, where we now look at downward mobility out of the top half of the distribution, where blacks are more downwardly mobile than whites. If a characteristic led to less downward mobility, then we would hope to see downward sloping lines. And so we do see that here again for education, that higher, with more education, you're less likely to be downwardly mobile. Among those with poor education levels, the black-white lines close up quite a bit. And in fact, whites are more downwardly mobile, but you know, these are very noisy estimates, as you can see by these are 95% confidence intervals. And then if you go out to those with very high education, again you see the gaps start to disappear. But again, where the bulk of the distribution is, particularly for African Americans, you still see a fairly sizable black-white gap for those, say, with some college or just a high school degree. This shows you how the test score, how the downward mobility estimates change with AFQT scores, and again you see this downward slope and that these gaps narrow quite a bit. Now, unlike for upward mobility, family structure doesn't appear to play much of a role in explaining the probability of moving out of the top half of the income distribution. You see these are pretty flat, don't appear to be very different. For wealth, we see that at both ends, at very low wealth and at very high wealth, you see some narrowing of black-white gaps in downward mobility. And here is where we might argue that the wealth protection may be more of an important aspect in terms of thinking about intergenerational mobility for those to preserve their advantage rather than for upward mobility. So here maybe having a house or other forms of capital might be important for blacks to preserve their place in the distribution. Okay, so just to kind of summarize, it suggests that cognitive skills are the thing that comes out as front and center as what can explain these gaps, these test scores. There is a lot of debate in the literature about how well AFQT scores might capture things. There's a relatively recent paper in the American Economic Review that I think is important, and in future work I want to kind of emphasize a bit more, which argues that when you condition on AFQT scores, you're actually introducing a form of selection, because blacks with similar AFQT scores to whites end up being better educated. So really what you should be doing is controlling for both AFQT and education simultaneously. And then if I did something like that, which I don't know how to do with these non-parametric regressions with more than one variable, I think you'd see those lines move apart a bit. So this can be taken to sort of suggest, in terms of thinking about when in the life cycle are things important, not everything is sort of determined by adolescence. I mean, even the charts I showed you suggest there is still a gap, but even more so when you take into account this factor, it suggests that there's still scope for things in the labor market potentially to influence mobility differences. The other important point is, a generation ago, I guess, the bell curve book had come out arguing that used AFQT scores, but argued that this was a measure of native intelligence, or that it was purely genetic. And I think there is just a huge amount of literature that's argued that that's completely wrong, that there are lots of environmental influences that influence test scores and even military test scores. And some of my work on the World War II era Rosenwald School analysis and the early life health analysis also showed that those interventions improved test scores. Education alone appears to matter, but you really see the gaps completely closed when you get to college attainment. Family structure appears to matter for upward mobility, but not so much for downward mobility. And low wealth especially inhibits upward mobility for blacks. I should probably add the point that high levels of wealth has this important protective effect against downward mobility for blacks as well. Okay, and I'll just kind of wrap up. I hate kind of reading off conclusion slides because they just kind of repeat what I've said. But I think maybe the other thing worth mentioning is that in the intergenerational mobility literature, now there's this huge new focus on geography. The work by Raj Chetty and his co-authors got a lot of attention. But importantly, and in work that I'm trying to do now, I want to focus on the interaction of race and geography, because in their data they had huge samples of, they basically had the population tax records starting from around 1996 onwards. So they could hone in with huge samples on local areas, but they don't take into account race because they don't have that in the tax records. So I'm happy to stop there.
So I have a few questions.
Okay.
One of which is the frame of the paper.
Okay.
So to suggest that we're going to start a discussion about intergenerational mobility, income mobility, with the assumption that the big determining factors for this inequality would be slavery and segregation, to me seems to be kind of problematic, right? So what about continuing sort of legacies of racial inequality, racism, these sort of like present factors that maintain racial bias, just sort of unequal sort of circumstances that, persist. So that's question one. And then the second question is about the cognitive ability argument that you make with regards to test scores. So it seems to me that like test scores as a measurement of cognitive ability in and of themselves is an issue to the extent that those tests are already like representative of cultural biases. So like people talk about this a lot of times with regards to SAT scores, about how they are not sort of like culturally neutral, and that they themselves represent, for lack of a better word, like white supremacy, racism, like sort of like these like sort of extra sort of like things that we might think of as not neutral, but as sort of representing the problem in and of themselves. So like we're not really testing for cognitive ability, we're getting sort of like representations of one sort of like social milieu or racial social milieu, right, rather than something else. So those are my two questions that I would put to you.
Okay. Should I go ahead?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I think those are points that I think are important. Some of this comes out of probably the discipline I've been trained in. So we start by probably from how we think about economic theory, and we think of outcomes as starting from human capital. So we're going to emphasize the development of human capital, and that gets a lot of emphasis in economics. And probably part of it is a political, ideological thing that maybe we're not always aware of, but infuse how we look at things and how our disciplines look at things. That's not necessarily a good excuse. We should try to move away from that when we can. But when I'm writing a paper for an economics audience, the standard models are going to be framed in terms of these kind of human capital development. And so the first order thing is going to be trying to think about how does education matter. And so that kind of gets a little bit at both questions. To some degree, the slavery and segregation is a little bit of just, probably should take it a little more seriously, but it's a little bit of just rhetoric to start the paper to sort of say, it was a little bit of a question in my mind, because maybe it's sort of thinking of it as, suppose you want to be really conservative in the sense that let's assume there's no racism in America today, and everything is just purely based on historical legacy. In that context, what would estimates of intergenerational mobility imply? Okay, and then you can think of that as a base case, where then on top of that, if you have other factors going on. So I guess what I'm saying is, if say you want to start with a starting point of the 1960s, where maybe the typical American thinks, okay, we ended racism in 1965 or something. Do we need affirmative action today for something that is perceived to have ended 50 years ago? And if your answer is that it just takes 2 generations for things to equalize, then you might think, okay, everything's fine. I didn't talk about translating these mobility measures into the number of generations, but in other work I've done, I've basically argued it takes probably 5 to 7 generations. So that would suggest that even if you put aside ongoing forms of racism or other institutional factors, that alone, the legacy stuff, even today, matters. But I take your point. I don't want this to, I don't want the paper to be about whether or not there's racism today, but of course that could be part of what's going on, and maybe, it's also tougher to quantify. How do I build in those factors into this kind of structure with the data? You can try to do it maybe taking the geography of where people are and maybe how much racism they're exposed to. On the test score issue, I think that's a fair point, and I didn't bring up there are arguments about this test scores being culturally biased, and then it may be an issue of how much of that is cultural bias, how much of it is purely your ability to do math or reading or what have you. I would gather that a fair amount of the signal in that data is about your ability to do math and answer reading questions, but I'm sure there is some element of bias involved there. I think in terms of interpreting the results, then it may be still useful to show that if you use these measures, if the gaps narrow, maybe part of the interpretation is it's not just about skills, but it's also about your ability to do what the dominant culture, expects you to do, or answer questions in the way it expects, which is still an interesting finding, I would argue. So,
I had 2 things. I just wanted to follow up on half of what Nancy asked about in terms of part of the way you framed the paper was around causes and policy intervention.
Yeah.
So if I'm thinking of the Bertrand and Moulin Nathan paper on just Emily and Greg versus Letitia getting jobs, so it's a experimental test of discrimination based on the type of names one might have, or racial discrimination. So if we're thinking about policy interventions, though, and part of the reproduction of patterns of lack of social of mobility is because of continued discrimination racial discrimination in the labor force, doesn't that mean that even if it's hard to quantify, we still might have to think about those mechanisms and think about how to maybe test, see how they factor into and lead to the lack of the closing of the gap?
Yeah, no, I think that's a reasonable point. So it's there's sort of an element of, you take what you have data on. There are a bunch of things I didn't show you where, there's a lot of attention now about non-cognitive skills, for example. So use the data in the NLSY to look at some of those things. At the end of the day, you have a pretty big residual of like, okay, there's lots of things that don't account for the gap. And I didn't draw it out very much in this paper, but I tried to a little bit in the talk about this idea that if you take the test score stuff, it tells you the story that it's about what's achieved by adolescents. With all the caveats, I think there's still a fair amount that's not about stuff so it's this sort of pre-labor market, post-labor market divide, and I think there's plenty left over for understanding these gaps that are after you enter the labor market. I think, I really like that paper because it was an innovative way of front and center, putting this as an important issue. But I'm not sure, I haven't been able to think of ways to, I think maybe the way to get at some of the more institutional things is by using historical data, where you could, some work I'm doing now, I'm looking at the effects of redlining. And I think there where you can use like geographic differences and where patterns that were induced by particular laws that took place, where you could start to get at some variation that you could argue is due in particular to laws that force segregation and then use that pattern. For instance, that's not getting at the labor market thing you're talking about, but if you can find analogous things with labor market, I think that could be a fruitful way to get at some of this. And I think with the data that's starting to come online with, can put in a plug for the Census Center, we're starting to, use linked historical censuses. And there we might now know the locations of people and the kinds of labor markets they were in for huge samples of blacks, and in a historical period where you could kind of maybe nicely code discrimination in labor markets in some ways. And so I think that's potentially fruitful.
Marcus?
I was going to build on something that Ansley and Dawson said, and this may indeed be a methodological sort of epistemological thing because I'm the third political scientist to talk about this. But I think that, as Professor Dawson said, this is really important. I really appreciate this work. This is important for policy implementation and that sort of thing. But I think that their points and my points sort of are about what seems to be a sort of slippage that occurs where there's an analysis of a macro level issue of inequality, and then that is linked to a sort of micro analysis of like people and what people are doing. So we're talking about macro level inequality among black people and white people, and then the paper goes on to talk about cognitive abilities among young black people, and then family structures among individual families. And of course, like so on page 2, I think you say that when you're discussing like interpreting test scores and discussing cognitive abilities, there aren't measurements of innate endowments, but rather reflective of background, these other influences. But I think the slippage occurs when that is a pass is made at the other things that influence this, and then still cognitive abilities is pushed to the forefront, right? So then you have sort of policy interventions that aim to affect individual people, but not all the different structures that were sort of glossed over, like
Yeah.
and mentioned, but not really dealt with in a
Yeah,
way.
I mean, I would say like the stuff I talked about with neighborhoods at the end, you know,
Yeah.
I mean, that's potentially really important and getting a lot of attention, and like I also said, wealth, you know, in some ways, I think, and I maybe didn't draw this out as well in the paper as I should, that, yeah, maybe rather than emphasizing the importance of cognitive abilities, but the idea that it's capturing all the factors that could be, you know, the schools, the neighborhoods, you know, housing discrimination, all sorts of aspects that all end up being captured by this as potentially a proxy for other stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, language is important, and, you know, I take your point that you know, maybe it's more emphasized as it being about ability than what it's potentially proxying for.
So since many of my concerns were already addressed, actually, I was just wondering about method. It seems to me that what, you know, as a historian, right, so we deal with sort of the larger sort of things that you've glossed over in a certain kind of way. And I'm wondering if, so I'm not certainly, you know, comfortable with doing all of these sort of numbers and quantitative analysis, and perhaps you might not be comfortable with sort of doing a sort of historical analysis or sociological analysis, but I wonder if there's a way in which you could sort of partner with someone who's much more sort of qualitatively oriented to sort of put sort of the context and some of these other larger issues that I think people are sort of, to my mind at least, right now bringing up in the study, which I do like, which I found interesting, and I learned stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, you might find this happens more as you get, I'm hoping to do more of that, and I'm hoping to be, I've done a little bit of interdisciplinary work, more around health, where I've worked with, but not yet so much with I've worked on historical stuff, but still very much using heavy quantitative apparatus. I think there's an important role for that. I mean, I also would say, I'm not saying that I shouldn't do that stuff, but at the same time, I think, you know, I sort of view people as providing different aspects of an issue. You know, I'm good at the, you know, even within economics, I'm not good at the theory, and I don't try to do the theory, but I try to do, you know, the kind of the careful empirical work, and then hopefully with theory say, you know, other people can kind of say, okay, these are interesting facts. Can I either explain them theoretically, or do they, you know, contradict certain theories or not? So I take your point. I mean, I'm more and more I'm interested in historical work, and I've thought about that. You know, in this redlining project that I'm working on now, I realize there's, you know, I only know the tip of the iceberg in terms of a century of stuff that determines segregation. And so knowing, you know, working with somebody who could point me to all of the stuff I should be thinking about would be really valuable.
I was going to bring up another question. So I really think this one is very important, right? Because I can't run these numbers. I can't think of these numbers. But I also think about like how I think about the meaning of race and how people in philosophy and political theory are trying to understand race. And someone like Sally Haslinger talks about race as a sort of like a set of social relations that are produced vis-a-vis institutions and individual sort of like relationships within these institutions, right? So like race becomes more than just sort of someone marking a box like on the census, but becomes sort of like race itself then would be imbued in these other measures that we think about as distinct. Like, you know, like how So like in this one article of hers that I think is really great, she talks about the racial social meanings. So it's like, not only is it about how school, like, not only is it about how race is sort of carried out through people's sort of perception of it and how people are perceived as race individuals and then how interactions unfold, but how education itself and how schools itself reproduce race, right? So then how these institutions sort of maintain these social hierarchies and social meanings, right? So my question is, and this is purely like just hypothetical, you know, like you just said, I don't do theory stuff, I do the numbers, but I think the question would be, like, what would it mean to quantify something like that? You know, like, what would it mean to think about race in that kind of way through numbers? Because I think that doing something like that quantitatively, to me, would begin to open up the sorts of things that the data can tell us about, you know, how race is being reproduced vis-a-vis intergenerational income gaps and all this other stuff. So it's just like, you know,
I'm not
sort of
sure I have a lot to
generative
kind of
questions,
say.
yeah.
I mean, there's some interesting work, I don't know how well it relates to the point you're making about how people identify, you know, like, so I saw some interesting work about how people have classified themselves, you know, in the historical censuses again. You can find the same people who sometimes identify their race differently. And you could maybe relate that to other contextual things, and maybe that gets a little bit about how that issue. And then, of course, in the more recent surveys now, there's a whole, you know, menu of how you can identify yourself, and that might lead to some research you could do on that.
Yeah, I'll keep my one finger for the end of the queue, unfortunately. The two fingers, I was going to just say, directly relevant to Ainsley's point, I think some quantitative sociologists are going to do some interesting work that on one hand are trying to imagine the processes of racialization and identification, and then linking that to economic outcome across generations. And I'm thinking of Bill Ortiz, Edward Tellis, and Tiana Pescial. and both of them, well, in separate pieces, Tiana's working with Tellis on one set of papers, and then Vilma Ortiz and Tellis have the book on racialization of Mexican-American populations and how that has led to questions of economic and other types of assimilation, or not lack of assimilation, racialization. So I think the sociologists are probably way ahead where political sciences and probably ahead where economics are. Those trying to think about race more theoretically, the same thing about how that works out empirically.
Well, first I just want to say thank you so much. I really did enjoy listening to your talk. But as I was listening to it, it wasn't exactly clear to me if you see race as operative in your analysis. So what exactly do you think of race, the work race is doing in this story? It almost seems like race, black and white, are almost like identifiers more than operative categories that have any impact on the people. And so you could make the case, based on your analysis, that, you know, you're looking at two groups of people. One happened to be black, the other happened to be white, and the people who happen to be black have less, you know, access to wealth and less intact families and less, you know, less access to quality education and decent housing, and not that they are put in that disadvantage because they are black. Which gets me to the second question, which is, you know, you talked about it in the paper, and I just wanted to hear more about what you think are policy prescriptions, particularly with your background with affirmative action. Just what do you see as some of the, you know, substantive policies we can enact that can kind of get at these issues?
Thanks, I appreciate all of, you know, this. These are comments that I usually get and think about.
They don't ask these sorts of questions.
So yeah, no, I probably, you know, it's a large part of this is purely descriptive, and it's saying, if you call yourself this in this survey, what are your outcomes? And, you you know. But I think you can interpret these things potentially as, you know, you know, there's potential to delve into this a lot more and think about these things of what race means, and, you know, I'm not really going there in this work, but I definitely take your point. In terms of policy prescriptions, you know, you know, I'm guilty of this thing of kind of motivated, and this is important for policy, but then when you get down to it, what do you actually want to push? Let me move a little bit away from race just for the moment, and just in terms of, you know, intergenerational mobility more generally. I think there's a dimension of this that's definitely, I'm convinced that early life matters an awful lot, and I'm fairly convinced that the stresses around poverty, purely environmental stresses you get, I mean, now I'm thinking pollution, exposure to toxins, exposure to lead, a lot of these things matter hugely. And so I think of it as a sort of a series of things that you can do, you know, from you know, cleaning up environmental stuff to providing, you know, nurse home visitations for pregnant women, to, you know, having, you know, full coverage of, you know, of things like WIC and food stamps, and a lot of stuff where we already have the apparatus, and where in economics there's a lot of good research showing that these have important long-run outcomes. So I think there's like a clear thing that I think the empirical work is really solid, and most people could hardly, you know, I think other than the willingness to spend the money, the cost benefit is very clear. So I think there's a really strong case for a lot of early life stuff. Then I think as you move up in the life cycle, stuff like childcare, universal pre-K, things like that, I think are would be pretty important factors. That there's a lot of the literature on intergenerational mobility and its intersection with inequality. How much of the rising inequality is being associated with lower mobility, and people are. That's an issue that people have been debating, but I think kind of a big part of that to me, and just kind of anecdotally even as a parent of, you know, 2 kids, I think in the current time period, there's almost no end to the amount of money you can spend if you have it on advantages for your kid, you know, from athletic activities to, you know, what have you. And my sense is, you know, generations ago, this was much more of a community, you know, you were part of the park district and you did your team sports, and now you can do that and you can do 5 other things too. And so I think the potential to transfer advantages to your kids is just really huge, and growing inequality is widening those things. So how you know, I'm not sure the answer to all of that. I mean, some of that is going to be through more equalizing of school finance and trying to equalize, you know, some of it, I don't know, is really hard to counteract. Parents are going to want to confer advantages, and we live in a world now where that's just so much easier. So I'm not sure what the solution is on that front. And then I think there are important roles for labor markets, again, abstracting from the racial issues, things like decline of unionization, declining real value of the minimum wage, the deregulation in a lot of industry, financial industry deregulation that's led to a lot of inequality. I think those are all things that if we set up institutions with, you know, better bargaining for workers, potentially higher tax rates at the high end. Those would be things that would potentially also be things to look at. That again, where inequality, reducing inequality, I think, would then also promote mobility. You know, if we're thinking about black-white differences in intergenerational mobility, obviously some of what I've already said would translate into hopefully narrowing some of that, but on top of that, I think you would be thinking about particularly, you know, segregation of schools, school finance, inequalities, quality of teachers, quality of resource, you know, of inputs in schooling. Then you get to the labor market issues where, you know, I'm not sure how, you know, what you would, I think in terms of financial, the stuff I'm talking about, think of working on redlining. I think, you know, there's a regulatory side to maybe re-examining the whole issue and thinking about whether or not we need stronger regulations on the housing market side of things. You know, would all be, I'm not sure on the employment side what should be done exactly, but, you know, I think those would all be potential policy levers to look at.
With Marcus, Professor Dawson.
So I kind of wanted to push back a little bit on the idea that you were not necessarily theoretically inclined, and that is a you know, kind of a, and it ties into what Julius was saying. That's obviously what Professor Dawson and Ansley were saying, but also with what Julius was saying, that you know, I'm wondering how you're operationalizing race in the sense that you had options in terms of figuring out what the latent biases, the latent factors were if you were doing structural equation modeling or some type of factor analysis, right? You had those options. So I'm wondering, when it comes to operationalizing the way that you're using race in particular, why you haven't considered those options in terms of trying to figure out what those latent factors are in race. So there's that, and I also am wondering, Marcus kind of mentioned, Marcus mentioned this potential for an ecological fallacy in the interpretation of the results. And I'm wondering, you know, even now as you were describing the particular policy implications, and this still, again, goes back to what Ansel was saying, and you said as well, like the importance of words, but it seems like the suggestions that you're making have a lot to do with treating blackness and encouraging egalitarian measures in terms of, like you said about having kids and having the opportunity to give children as much as you want, and I feel like it disengages with the disproportionate effects of anti-blackness and white supremacy in general. So if you could kind of speak to
Okay, yeah, so in terms of why didn't I use latent factors modeling, I'm not really familiar with that, so that's something I can learn some more about and see, but I think there's still value in, the descriptive facts. But I take your point, it's been made a few times, and something I could try to learn some more about. Your second point about policy issues, so I'm trying to think now, but maybe repeat that a little bit.
I thought a lot of the suggestions you were making, which were very fair and very in line with a lot of some of the status quo agendas of a lot of different organizations, were geared towards kind of leveling the playing field and by conferring particular advantages to people who have limitations for whatever reason, right? We're leaving that off the table, and it kind of reiterates the notion that's kind of floating around about why blackness is disadvantaged, so that there's an anti-black effect that's also occurring. And so I'm wondering if you have anything comes to mind about particular policy implementations that can address that anti-blackness. So it, in a lot of ways, goes to the paper that Dawson was talking about if you have a black name, right, you won't get a callback for a job, right? So, you know, rather than those ideas of saying, well, you know, increasing early childhood education and providing more broad-based opportunities for social integration or whatever, figuring out, are there other policy implications that can take away from the power that is being placed on blackness and taking away that,
Okay.
and causing the disadvantage, excuse me.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I have a very concrete kind of view of, you know, and some of this can be informed by what I've been exposed, but, you know, I sort of see a set of research where I think the estimates are really strong, they're causally identified, and maybe that speaks to what it is we choose to study to some degree, but, you know, that's what I feel really confident that I know. Now, maybe the fact that, you know, say you take lead exposure, that there's a deeper issue there of why is it that, you know, people, you know, African Americans live in houses that are built in periods where they use lead paint, and that goes back to residential segregation policies and all that. You know, I take that there's an underlying deeper thing, but if I'm going to try to assess, like, okay, what's the policy today, you know, I guess it's sort of a sequence of stuff you can target. And one of them is going to be targeting how do you get, you know, children not to be exposed to lead directly, you know, maybe through regulation or cleaning up houses. You know, there's cities that have forced ordinances where you have to clean that up. And then some of it is this deeper issue that gets back to maybe some of the other research I'm going to do on redlining that gets at that. So, you know, I'm probably not going to be very successful at the deeper. You know, I know it's a role for somebody to play, but probably not for me to get at the how we conceptualize race and how that ends up influencing some. I can get at some of that through things I can measure and then put into these models, but probably I'll be guilty of omitting some of these other deeper factors.
It's not like a sociologist, which is not how I was trained. So I'll have two questions, and the first one is not easy, but it's more straightforward, and the second one is probably too convoluted. So the first one is, are you thinking about extending this work to Latino and Asian populations in the U.S. and do you speculate what you think you might find if you did it, unless somebody else has done that work already? The second question is I'm sort of thinking about your findings as sort of a boundary condition in terms of social mobility, at least with respect to blacks. And what I mean by that is that since it doesn't include people who are incarcerated, it seems like it's the best news version of what one might expect. And this is where the sociological part comes back in. I'm wondering if there's actually a regime change in the historical data that you study. I'm using regime change in the econometric sense, not the relational sense. In that there's a number of political scientists, Ruthie Gilmore, Naomi Yorikawa, Veshla Weaver, who have talked about the massive rise in incarceration. And then there's a number of sociologists like David Pager, and then political scientists like Amy Lerman and Veshla Weaver talk about the effects of incarceration of not just people who've been convicted of crimes, but entire communities, and what that does to possibilities for mobility. So I'm wondering if there's a period where the actual the transition matrix for social mobility change, and it changed by race because of the increase in incarceration.
Yeah. So on your first question on So I've started doing some work and I have some results using the NLSY 79 using Hispanics. Again, just very broad brush, the upward mobility, downward mobility, and you basically see that they lie almost exactly in between whites and blacks. I have not looked at Asians. I don't think I have the samples there to look at that. There's an economist at Brown who's been doing some work on Nathan Hilger, but I haven't read his work yet. Who's been looking at Asian Americans and thinking about, are they a model minority or not, and issues around that. I don't really remember his punchlines, so I should say it. But I think there's work I'm interested in. I think there's an interesting emerging issue around college admissions for Asians. The fact that you have incredibly well-qualified Asians who are not getting into some of the top universities, and that's starting to, I think, maybe you guys are more familiar with this than I am, and even that I imagine this is going to be an emerging issue. In terms of this issue of it, is this the best case version? So I'm not really sure. I need to think a bit more about it. At some level, the NLSY results, so that in the SIP case, it's the non-institutionalized population, and I'm matching to administrative earnings. So you have to be working for an employer that's filing tax forms and all that. So there's
even discouraged workers are not even.
Yeah. So there might be people working under the table. Like kind of the informal sectors not even being included. Forget about even people who aren't even in the labor market at all. The NLSY is a little bit looser in that it's not relegated to the non-institutionalized population. You even have measures of, have you ever been in jail? People are followed in principle even if they go to prison and then come back out. So, I don't know, I don't have a great sense of how much that's really capturing, but I think it's capturing a little bit more, and it's not purely conditioned on people who are never exposed to incarceration. But the results are fairly similar. I'm not, it's possible that you could do some kind of bounding thing if you put in zero, if you kind of, and probably something that should be done, is to kind of take whatever we do know about rates of incarceration by demographic, by other things that you can kind of statistically model. Okay, suppose we assume these factors are going on, and then add it to my analysis, and then say put in zeros for all the income. What kind of numbers does that get you? And I'm guessing it probably does look a bit worse, but how much worse, I'm not really sure. I think it's a good point about, everything I'm doing is in the modern period where we've got these
Higher rates already.
Yeah, where these cohorts are going through the period in which incarceration explodes, where you have crack epidemic, and we just, be great to have cohorts from the 30s and 40s where we have good income data and can do something like this. And I think that kind of research is hopefully will be done over the next, decade, and we'll maybe get a better sense of, are these mobility transition things really different now than they were? I mean, I kind of suspect they were, given what I've been saying, that where you do see these episodic periods of rapid progress that you're clearly not seeing for these more recent cohorts. And I think that's going to be tied partially to incarceration, but also this explosion in inequality after 1980 that's going to be wrapped up in these numbers as well.
That's some of the earlier ones, if you believe the Heckman and Lance papers, were due to federal interventions
Right.
on employment policy.
So thank you for this really informative presentation. I really enjoyed.
So I was wondering if you could talk more about this gap between the two studies that you cited between the post-war period and the 1970s, particularly in relation to the relationship between migration and desegregation and public health, or rather, what do you put it as, hospital desegregation?
Yeah.
Is that are you considering that as, or this body of literature, as both a northern and a southern phenomenon? And if so, how does migration play into that? Because I'm thinking about how in the 1950s in Chicago, there were like 500,000 black people sharing basically one hospital and a couple of beds and 5 other hospitals.
That's where I was born.
Right over there.
yeah, Providence, and then there were like 5 beds, at the 5 other hospitals, and black people were barred from the 70 other hospitals in the area. So I mean, is that important in terms of thinking about this plateau or this decline in the post-war period when you have black populations exploding in these cities?
I can tell you exactly what it is.
Oh.
So this is the Rosenwald picture. So this is, if you look at, so let me walk you through this. The red line shows you for people who are born outside the South, the black-white gap in completed schooling was roughly about a year. People born from 1880 throughout this time period. The blue line shows you the black-white gap for people born in the South. Okay, so they could be living in the North. Part of this is going to pick up people as part of the Great Migration, but it's fixing where you were born. And it basically shows that between cohorts born between World War I and World War II, you see this convergence based on where you were born. And the black-white gap narrows even from Southern born to just 1 year, and then the cohorts look fairly similar. Now, behind this, both white and black education levels are rising. These are just differencing that out. And the point of this other paper was to show that this is now on another axis. The number of Rosenwald schools by cohorts when they were around age 7 sort of explodes around this period, and the paper's about, showing how much of this explosion of schools can explain this narrowing gap. And that's where I argue we think we can explain about 50% of it. And part of that is through migration. So one of the things we found was that if you lived in a county where you were in these schools, and we look at your, in the 1940 census, they asked where you lived 5 years ago. If you were exposed to those schools in 1935, you were much more likely to have moved to the north. So part of that, we think, is really greater economic opportunities through migration. But we don't break down how much of that is. So here, none of it is just, it's just saying all of this is due to, all of what we're finding through the Rosenwald schools was purely a Southern phenomenon. And we're saying a lot of that was purely due to having better educational opportunities. This paper is about the 60s civil rights hospital desegregation. And again, we're kind of differencing out everything from the North in the end. So we're saying relative to the improvements in the North, how much of the black-white gap was due to a phenomenon that happened in the South. And part of it could have been through people migrating, but here this is past the big peak of the Great Migration. So here the idea is, for example, to show, so this is post-neonatal mortality rates, which we basically use as a proxy for your access to healthcare. And you see that there's a large decline in the black-white gaps in post-neonatal mortality that happens right around the time of the introduction of hospital desegregation through civil rights and Medicare. And so you see that, there's this dramatic drop, and we basically then show that for border states, the black-white gap, and in what we call Rust Belt states. And then you sort of have a mirroring of the black-white gaps in these AFQT test scores that occur for the same cohorts based on when they were born. And so you see that this gap dramatically narrows for southern-born blacks relative to whites. There's a, it goes from minus 20 percentiles to about minus 10 for the relatively narrow group of cohorts born from the early 60s to the early 70s. And when we do all the statistical stuff, we again find numbers in anywhere from 30 to 60% of this narrowing in black-white gaps could be attributed to better access to health in life.
I know you had a question, however, we're out of time, so I apologize.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So, yes, thank you so much, and please join me in thanking Dr. Mazumder.